It's time for the Science Cafe!
Learn about the latest technologic innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Since we've mentioned it's free.
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.
Good evening and welcome to the second virtual session of Science Cafe New Hampshire, where the beer costs less, but the service varies. I'll remind you that you can submit your questions for the panel via Facebook and YouTube, and we'll get to as many as we can. But before we begin, I'd like to point out that Science Cafe New Hampshire is a team, and sometimes teams change. In this case, Sandy Belknap, who's been managing our social media and marketing, is moving on, and we want to give her a loud shout out and many thanks. We appreciate all that you've done for us, Sandy. Good luck. Last month's first foray into the virtual Science Cafe on COVID-19 attracted more people than we could fit in a bar and got more replays online than anything we've ever done before. So we're going to do it again this month with a few improvements. While reactions were overwhelmingly positive, there was one comment that caught our attention about my introduction looking a bit like a hostage video. So we've called in Sarah Eck and David Brooks to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Sarah Eck is a biochemist, a mom, a New Hampshire native, and a co-founder of Science Cafe New Hampshire. And we're thrilled to have her back with the team. Sarah?
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and it's hard to believe that Science Cafe started nearly 10 years ago. We started initially in Concord and then expanded down to Nashua, and we have hosted over 100 different sessions with over 300 experts sitting on our panels, and we've reached over thousands of New Hampshire residents to discuss issues of scientific importance. We have also watched other science cafes sprout up across the state of New Hampshire, which is really exciting. This evening, I would like to introduce you to our original moderator, David Brooks.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, hi, I'm Dave Brooks. I'm with the Concord Monitor and the Granite Geek blog, and I was the original moderator down in Nashua. Now I moderate the Concord sessions, and I'm very excited that the folks have gotten together virtual versions of Science Cafe, although I am looking forward to going back into the third dimension and having a beer again. So tonight's session is going to be about flying cars, more technically roadable aircraft, which is a really clumsy term. This is an interesting and exciting topic for New Hampshire because we actually have quite a lot of connection. There's going to be 3 companies participating. One of them is Terrafugia, which is making a 4-wheel airplane with folding wings, and they've actually been flying their test model out of Nashua Airport for well over a year. Another one is PAL-V, which is a European company that has set up an office at the Manchester Airport, and they are making a 3-wheel gyrocopter that can drive on the road. And the third company is Samson Sky out of Oregon, which is making a 3-wheel pusher plane, pusher like the Terrafugia. So we've got all sorts of technologies involved, and this is real world stuff. These are actual models that are actually flying and will be viable, purchasable, I guess is the word, within the next year or two. So it's really neat to have this and to have the New Hampshire connection. So sit back and you're comfortable at home and watch this and look forward to a real world Science Cafe in the future. But for the moment, let's talk to Rick Irving, our moderator.
On the technology part to begin with, things like the design work and the materials, the engines. And then in the second half, we'll go to the moving technology into adoption. So things like licenses, inspections, rules of the road or rules of the air, whatever that appears to be. And so you don't have to worry about the questions. Send them in whenever you think of them, whatever you'd like. And the team behind us will triage those and feed us them in that order. So we will have the panel introduce themselves. and basically just give us a little bit about your background, your company, your what your car looks like. And during this conversation, for the folks at home, we'll also be showing some videos and perhaps some slideshows as well. So we will start with Kevin Colburn of Terrafugia.
Thank you very much, Rick.
Sure.
I appreciate the opportunity here. So yeah, I've got some slides queued up to give you a sense of what Terrafugia is all about. And so, Scott, if you could cue up the first slide, we'll see about a dozen slides. I'll go through them pretty quickly, and then we'll have a short video, and then we'll move on. Yeah, so again, thanks again. I'm Kevin Colburn. I'm Vice President and General Manager of Terrafugia, based down in Woburn, Mass. And what happened is in 2006, so 14 years ago, 5 MIT graduate students in a basement lab decided that they wanted to build the world's first practical flying car. Now, why do they want to do this? Because they had read a recent survey, and you go to the next slide, please, Scott, that showed that the 5 biggest impediments to pilots spending more time in their airplanes had to do with when you get to, delaying or canceling a trip if visibility drops, because these aircraft typically don't have the right instruments and the pilots don't have the right rating to be able to fly through clouds and low visibility. The cost of storing the plane in a hangar, the inconvenience and the cost of aviation fuel, the delay between airport arrival and takeoff, and then when they land at a small regional airport where they're going, how do they get from there to their destination? Because you can't use your cell phone in the plane. You have to call a taxi or find some other way to get there. Next slide, please. So the folks, the founders of Terrafugia, believed that a flying car would solve all these things. Now, they knew that patents for flying cars had been granted for 100 years. First one was granted in 1918. And as you can see from these slides, some look like they might work and some might not. But the combination of a new light sport aircraft category in the FAA that allowed for small planes to get to market more rapidly, and the availability of lightweight, stiff materials like titanium and carbon fiber made them feel like the conditions were finally right to get a practical flying car to market and make it an ongoing business. Next slide, please. So a small team, about 6 or 7 people, spent 3 years working very hard for very little money, scraping up investments here and there. And in 2009, they got the proof of concept vehicle you can see now off the ground for the first time. Pretty exciting moment, took them over 100 tries. And they instantly realized that reality does not always match theory, and a few changes had to be made. So they went back to the drawing board. They raised a few, got a few more investors on board, got some more deposits on board, got a few more team members. Next slide, please. In 2012, flew the second generation prototype for the first time, which was really exciting and great. And essentially what happened was then they realized that once again, reality still didn't quite match theory. There were a few things they had to tweak. And we've essentially been finishing up the 3rd generation design since that day in 2013, when they first publicly flew it at Oshkosh, a general aviation convention in the summertime in Wisconsin, and discovered a few more issues. But let's go to the next slide to talk about the concept of the car. So the idea is that you store it in your garage. It doesn't have to be a triple car garage. It can be a single car garage. Next slide, please. And when you want to go fly somewhere, you drive on public access roads. Next slide, please. You can fill up the gas tank at your corner gas station with 91 octane or higher auto gas. Doesn't require avgas. Next slide, please. When you get to the airport, wave your badge. Again, this is not Logan or Manchester. This is a small airport where you have a badge. Gate opens, you go in. Next slide, please. The wings unfold with the push of a button in less than 60 seconds. You get out, do your pre-flight inspection. Next slide, please. And because you've gotten there, the engine's warmed up, your bag's in the car, you've done your inspection, generally within about 10 minutes, you're flying. So that's the concept. And then when you land at the destination airport, you can reverse the process, fold the wings up with the push of a button, and drive to your final destination. instead of calling a taxi or getting your customer or your client or your friend to come pick you up. Next slide, please. So it solves all those problems that I talked about in the second slide. You can land and fold the wings in under a minute and drive directly to your destination. You can store it in your garage. You don't have to pay hangar fees because it fits in a single car garage. You fill up the gas tank at the corner gas station. You're reducing your door-to-door time and hassle. And in the event that the visibility drops in a way that you weren't expecting, instead of having to land and sit there potentially for hours or days until the weather clears, you push the button, you fold the wings up, you get on the road, and you keep making progress towards your destination. That's a powerful incentive for people not to push it and get themselves into low visibility situations, which can be, which really are often very fatal in general aviation aircraft. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is a picture outside. So we have, we rent hangar space at the Nashua Airport where we do some of our development work and we do a lot of testing, as David mentioned in the introduction. And this is our 3 generations of prototypes. The one on the left is the proof of concept that flew in 2009. The middle one is the 2nd generation that first flew in 2012. And the one on the right with the wings fully extended is our 3rd generation, which first flew last summer. Next slide. Oh, right. So the next slide. Okay, so next slide is a video, a quick video of us flying that 3rd generation prototype on the right last summer. You're going to see an approach by our chief test pilot into runway 14 at the Nashua Airport. And a couple things to take a look at, it's maybe a 2 or 3 minute video, are for the pilots out there. You can notice that when he lands, there's very little flare. He essentially drives all 4 wheels onto the runway. And then he leaves one hand on the yoke because he's a pilot, but he puts one hand on the steering wheel and he drives the vehicle down the runway. And what you can't see is that he's got a brake pedal and accelerator in between the rudder pedals, and he's braking with his foot. You can roll that. So that, in a nutshell, is what Terrafuji is all about.
Great job. So have you flown one of these yourself?
I have not. I had an opportunity when I joined the company in 2013 as the VP of engineering at the time. That chief test pilot you see in the cockpit finally felt like they were safe enough to take other people on board. And there were a few spots, and I felt like it wouldn't be good for me to jump into the first slot in line my first day. It wouldn't really win the hearts and minds of the new employees, so I declined. I'm dying to get back up there, but I haven't had a chance yet.
Well, thanks. Great job, Keith. Kevin, Keith, would you like to go next and tell us about yourself and your company and your plane?
Sure. I don't have a slide presentation, but I think you have a video that we could show. I'll just briefly speak about PAL-V. It's an acronym for Personal Air and Land Vehicle, and it's a company headquartered in the Netherlands. The form factor for the PAL-V is different than the Terrafugia. It is a 3-wheeled vehicle, 2-seater, but the form factor is what's called a gyroplane. And as we watch the video, you'll see that it looks like a helicopter, but it flies more like an airplane. That's one of the interesting characteristics about it. And you'll see that it's a very small form factor for the flight surfaces. The flight surfaces can easily fold up onto the roof and retract into the tail. It also has an interesting technology that's called a carver technology, where when you're driving on the road, the vehicle can actually lean like a motorcycle. And the landing gear extend when you go into flight mode, so the vehicle actually raises off the ground somewhat. But when it's in driving mode, it settles back down, and you're actually driving a little bit like a motorcycle through the turns. So those are a couple interesting things about the PAL-V. When we can watch the video, it'll give you a good idea of what it looks like. All right, great. So you saw two generations of the PAL-V. The first one in the beginning was what was called the PAL-V1, and it was a working prototype. It did its road tests during 2011 and its flight test during 2012. And that was the black vehicle in the beginning. It was originally designed as an inline two-seater, so the passenger would sit behind the driver/pilot. But they discovered that the market is more favorable for side-by-side. And so the orange one that you saw is a redesign of the original. That comes in a couple different flavors. There's one called the PAL-V Pioneer, which is like a limited edition. I think there's only 90 going to be produced, and it's top of the line. It has all the bells and whistles. And then there's the unlimited production run is called just the Liberty, or the Liberty Sport Edition, excuse me. So, I know this is a science group, so one of the things interesting about the PAL-V is the gyroplane form factor. And so just real briefly, if you're not familiar with the gyroplane, that form of flight was invented in the early 1900s by a Spanish gentleman. And it was the precursor to the helicopter. And what's different about it, although it has a rotor on the roof, the rotor in flight is not powered by the engine. It's a free spinning, it's almost like, those little toys with the propeller on a pencil, right? It's a free spinning rotor. It's the force of the prop in the back that pushes it. And as it pushes it through the airstream, the foil on the rotor actually pulls it through the air and causes it to spin constantly. So there's a couple advantages to that. I mentioned the flight surfaces are very compact. So your flight surfaces are up on the top of the roof, away from shopping carts and people opening and closing their doors. But it also has some safety characteristics. It serves almost as if it's a parachute. So because it's not powered, if your engine cuts off, you can glide down and pretty much land almost in its the rotor diameter. So your landing area can be fairly small in case of emergency. There's also no stall speed as in an airplane. If you're familiar with airplanes, you know that they each have a stall speed. If you go too slow, the wings stop producing lift and you fall out of the air. So a gyroplane has no stall speed, which makes it kind of neat to fly in one. You can kind of you can do interesting maneuvers, almost like a helicopter, instead of banking and turning like an airplane. Another safety feature, it has two engines. It has two Rotax 100 horsepower engines. When you're driving, you're using one of the engines. When you're flying, you're using both. So there's some redundancy there for safety as well. And just all in all, it's a very, very slick vehicle. It was rolled out at the Geneva Auto Show in 2018, 2019. And if you can find videos online of that. And the coronavirus shut down the Geneva Auto Show this year, so it wasn't there. But lots of events. It's mainly rolling out in Europe first, and it's coming to the United States in the next. We should have keys in a customer's hands in 2021. That'll likely be in the Netherlands, and then after that, the production gets ramped up and comes to the States.
Wow, that's excellent. Thanks, Keith. Now, I think David Brooks told us the headquarters is in Holland, but you have some facilities in Manchester.
Yeah, we have a
small have testing
office.
And simulation stuff going on there.
Yes, we have a VR experience. If you're interested in flying through VR goggles, we have that set up with flight controls, and so that's interesting. And we're also partnering with a company called National Flight Simulator, where they do flight training, fixed wing, rotary craft, and for commercial pilots as well, like continued training.
Wow.
So that's all coming together in Manchester.
Okay, so I could show up and say, I know Keith, can I use that little VR thing and practice on this?
Yeah, it's better if you have an appointment, but sure.
Oh, wow. Okay, I expected a firm no.
No, you can certainly come.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Now, Sam Boosfield is coming to us from Oregon. Can you tell us about yourself and your company and your plane?
Yeah, hi, and thank you for letting me get to know your guests and followers. The word is getting out that practical flying cars are becoming available, and not just a dream. And I, like many people, have had that dream since I was a kid. In 2008, I decided to do something about it and designed the first iteration of what was to become the Switchblade flying sports car. I'm very proud of what we did, what we produced, but I'm also proud of all the flying cars that have preceded ours, including the Transition and the PAL-V. It takes a lot of persistence, takes clear vision, ingenuity, and sheer guts to produce something like what we have now. And my hat is off to all who adventure down this road. So what is different about ours is perhaps the class of aircraft. Being an experimental aircraft, ours does not have to abide by the limits of the sport class. And as a result, we have a larger engine, which produces faster speeds on the ground and in the air. It also means that you as a buyer can't just drive it off the lot and take it home. You have to build 51% of the vehicle, which most of our buyers have elected to do in our Builder Assist Center to get it done in about 3 weeks under professional supervision. So we also started out by designing the vehicle to protect the wings and tail on the ground, as we felt that was key to getting more use out of the vehicle. I think people will feel more safe about owning a flying car, knowing that their wings and flying surfaces are tucked away while driving around town or between the airports. So what is the Switchblade like? Well, you'll see in the accompanying video that the wings swing out from inside the belly of the vehicle. They're protected behind the clamshell doors. The tail moves rearward and the tail surfaces unfold and the flying parts all lock in place, ready for flight. This takes about 3 minutes. And then a careful walk around to check on everything before flight. It's part of the duties of a pilot for any aircraft, and ours would be no different. One thing to keep in mind is that you just drove to the airport, and I think Kevin mentioned this. You just drove to the airport in the vehicle you're about to fly. So you have at least that much confidence that it's ready for operation, just due to that. And that confidence in the vehicle has another aspect, I think anyway. By personal constant use, driving and flying, you gain an increasing level of skill, just like when you spend a lot of time playing a computer game. You gain skills by that constant use, and it allows you to master higher and higher levels of game playing. So you get rusty if you leave off with any activity in piloting. I find that's true. But being able to drive and fly, you're constantly using the vehicle. And I believe that this constant use and honing of skills, plus the built-in safety of being able to land and drive if the weather isn't safe, will produce a much lower accident rate with flying cars than traditional aircraft. So let's see. You want to know a bit about the vehicle. So you want some specs? I'll give you some specs. Wingspan is 26 feet 9 inches, which is, for any pilot, you'll recognize it's close to a Piper Cherokee, which is a medium-sized small plane. Medium-sized small plane, if there is such a thing. Wing loading is about 27 pounds per square foot. So every square foot of the wing is lifting 27 pounds. And that's higher than a training vehicle, or anyone in the sport class that has to be light by definition in that class. And it's less than a high performance aircraft like the Lancer 4 that goes 300 some odd miles an hour. Landing takes about 700 feet in the simulator anyway. That's what we find. But I think use of brakes might shorten that down. Seems to. And we have 3 automotive sized disc brakes and tires. So, you really want to step on those brakes, you'll stop in a heartbeat. Takeoff looks like it'll be about 1,100 feet. We haven't flown yet, just so we can be clear on that. So we're coming up on test flights soon. The motor is the last one to be tackled here, and it's in that process of being integrated into the airframe right now. But we anticipate our max speed to be about 200 miles an hour. Cruise at 75% throttle, maybe 160 miles an hour, in that range anyway. Max gross takeoff weight, 1,850 pounds. So that gives you about 544 pounds useful load, which is to people, bags, and fuel. So you can't have 2 really big people, lots of bags, and go long distance. It wouldn't work for that. But, medium-sized people, medium-sized bags, and a bit of fuel, you can do quite a good range, maybe 450 miles with some reserves left over. It's got seats for 2 people, side by side, room for golf clubs, and a great view of wherever you feel like driving or flying. So there you go. Let's roll that video and see what it looks like, huh?
We're standing here with the Switchblade at AirVenture 2019, and I'd like to go ahead and show you what this Switchblade is all about. We started off 12 years ago wanting to know, how do you make aviation more useful? How do you get flying to be an everyday or a common experience? So that's what started as how do you do that? And the answer was the Switchblade. As we stand here today, we have the Switchblade right here, capable of being stored in your garage. You drive out to your home airport, swing the wings and tail out, take off, fly to your destination, swing the wings back in again, and never being stopped. We're proud to be fulfilling that decades-long dream of a flying car that actually works for people. It's something that you can use to carry you where you want to go all the time, any day of the week.
I'll just say this in closing out this part of it. That last video where it was at the house there, most people look at it and go, "Oh, that was virtual reality or 3D, 3D graphics and that kind of thing." Actually, was shot at last year's AirVenture just before the event at a friend's house. He has a house which is so immaculately kept, it looks like CG, but it's not. So there you go.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thanks, Sam. Okay, I think that gives us a great jumping off point to start the question and answer part of the session. And we have our first question. If this is mass marketed for a driver's ed course, will you create a vehicle that has controls on both sides like a driver's ed vehicle?
How did you want to do that? Just someone jump in and answer, or what?
Yes, please. Yeah.
It's a fairly complex machine for, I think you'd probably get your driver's license in a normal car and then learn the flying part in a rotable aircraft or something very similar. For instance, PAL-V does training in something called an auto gyro, that's the company name, auto gyro Cavalon. And that looks very similar to a PAL-V. That would be, doing the flying training is probably the more complicated part than the driving training.
I'm going to second that vote, because I don't think anyone's going to learn to drive in a car that's it's six figures in price in some fashion. But if you did really want to do it, I mean, you could do it in a Switchblade. We set up for international driving, so our cockpit is symmetrical left and right. For right drive countries, you have a plug and play, either right drive and fly or left drive and fly, or for training, you could do both. So for pilot training, you could fly in a Switchblade with dual controls, which is what you find in most training aircraft. That's an option that you could have. But man, I wouldn't recommend it for a first-time driver, that's for sure.
Yeah, the transition at Terrafugia will also have a stick on both sides, both seats. We will not have a steering wheel on both seats, though.
Okay. So Kevin and Keith, Sam mentioned the weight and the distance and the speed, those sort of statistics. The golf club certainly caught my eye. What about your planes? How do they compare in those terms?
Sure. So the transition, roughly same wingspan, 27 feet. The weight is also limited by regulation to 1,800 pounds. And Sam didn't mention, although I'm sure he would have, one of the biggest challenges with flying cars is staying under these regulatory weight levels. To take an aircraft, which needs to be as lightweight as possible, and then to add all the things to it that make it be able to drive on the road and stay at an 1,800 pound level is incredibly challenging from a technical perspective. In terms of flight speed, we don't go nearly as fast as the Samson Sky does. Part of the way we stay below our weight limit is that we have a single Rotax 912IS engine. And so our cruise speed is, on the order of 100 miles an hour, And with about the same useful load, we're shooting for the mid 500s pounds in terms of people and fuel and luggage. And the original idea was, to be able to fit golf clubs in the vehicle. Can't fit a whole lot else. These are not, roomy limousines. These are pretty tight corners. Again, you have to keep the weight down to be able to fly efficiently and to be able to stay in the regulatory zone. But so pretty similar in a lot of ways, just a little bit slower.
Okay, great.
And the PAL-V, if you want to know some stats on the PAL-V,
sure.
The max speed on the road is about 100 miles per hour. It's about 112 in the air. It's a little slower. The gyroplane is a little less efficient than the fixed wing. So the speeds are a little lower on the top end. It's about 550 pounds useful load. A couple interesting things, the takeoff roll is about 600 feet, which is a lot shorter than most fixed wings. And the landing roll is about 100 feet. So you can use very short airstrips. And in New Hampshire, we found out if you have space in your backyard for an airstrip, you can put in an airstrip in a lot of towns. So, with the PAL-V, you need a lot shorter of an airstrip. And just real quick, on the gyroplane technology, the reason that the takeoff is so short is there's a little motor, a little cable that engages the rotor on top when you're on the ground. And that's called a pre-rotator. And so part of the takeoff sequence is you engage that pre-rotator, you get your blade spinning under power, right? It's driven off the engine. And then before you take off, you disengage that. And that shortens the distance that you need for takeoff because your rotor is already up to almost flight speed. So that's why only 600 feet for takeoff.
Wow, that's great. We talked a little bit yesterday about the fuel, and Keith, Kevin, in your presentation, you mentioned you just pop into the gas station and go ahead and fill it up.
Yep.
What are the gas versus electric considerations?
Sure. So in terms of fueling the engine, the fuel, like I said, is 91 octane auto gas. If you are at an airport and you run out of fuel and you can't leave the airport to get auto gas, the engine will also run on 100 low lead. It's 100 L. It's not a problem. It actually has a slight preference for the auto gas, which made it the perfect engine for us to build a flying car around. In terms of electric, we made a decision a few years ago to change our ground drive approach from a pure mechanical approach. In other words, getting the power from the engine to the wheels. It used to be purely mechanical, but we ran into some durability challenges with our solution. So we switched over to something that we're going to implement soon, which is a pretty basic hybrid electric drivetrain. So when you're driving down the road, the engine will be running, but it'll be like a series hybrid, like a Chevy Volt, where that energy is providing, the energy from the gasoline is being converted into electrical energy, and motors will power the wheels.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
The PAL-V uses a very similar, if not the same engine as the Terrafuji, or two of them. So it uses 91 octane and all the same characteristics apply. It is direct drive. And just a point on, where we are with battery technology. Sometime in the future, we will have electric flying vehicles that have some significant range and carrying capacity. It's the energy density of a lithium-ion battery is a lot less than hydrocarbon gasoline. In other words, the battery weighs a lot more and you get a lot less power out of it. And so that limits your range. It makes the vehicle heavier. All those things will be solved in the near future. I have full confidence, but we're just not there yet. There's a Chinese company, the name's escaping me, but they've created a human-sized drone where it carries 2 people. It has 8 rotors on it, but the range on it is very limited. It's more of a amusement ride than something to be used for commercial or recreational purposes.
Yeah. The Switchblade also uses 91 octane auto gas, and it's the same. If you're on the airport and you want to substitute aviation fuel for that bit of flight or that bit of driving, even, you can. We just didn't figure most states would, or the EPA would love you to drive around the streets using not aviation fuel that has still lead in it, right?
Right.
So good choice on all 3 accounts. I think we're all on that same track.
And what about the manufacturing, the design? What is the outside of the shell of these planes, of these vehicles made from?
Yeah, so for the transition, it's mostly carbon fiber. And in places, because again, the challenge, I could say it all night long, the challenge of staying under the regulatory weight limit and keeping all the automotive features in there is incredibly difficult. And in fact, Terrafuji was able to win a concession from the FAA to increase the weight on our vehicle so that we were able to have a heavier vehicle than most others in the light sport category. In some areas where we don't need the stiffness of the carbon fiber, we use fiberglass, because it's about the same weight and it's a lot less expensive. Carbon fiber ain't cheap. But ours, and it's to stand under that weight limit, we have a lot of carbon fiber, a lot of titanium, a lot of aluminum. That's just how it goes.
Okay. And that's similar with the other two companies as well?
Yeah, Switchblade's mostly carbon fiber. It's got a little aluminum keel up the middle, which we might replace with carbon fiber, to be honest with you. It's built like a Lotus with a center keel down the middle and a floor plan and semi-monocoque above. And I think that's really how you have to go. I don't see how you, like Kevin said, I don't think there's any way of making the weight requirement without using carbon fiber mostly in your vehicle.
And the PAL-V is similar. It's aluminum, carbon fiber, and fiberglass, and some plexiglass.
So when it came down to making some of these decisions, a lot of it came to, because of the regulations, a lot of the decisions came down to making it as light as possible so that you could fit under that 1,800 pound limit.
That's right. Yeah, certainly with the transition, as I mentioned at the beginning, when the founders looked at the landscape, because the light sport aircraft category was created because there was a dearth of innovation in small aircraft at the time. And so in the early to mid 2000s, the FAA said, well, let's create this category. And the only restrictions were that the vehicle could have no more than 2 seats, and it had to be a piston powered reciprocating engine. Turbine was not okay. And it could weigh no more than 1,320 pounds. Beyond that, they said, whatever you want to do is fine. And so, and we're not going to come watch your flight tests. We're not going to come read your reports. We're not going to be in your britches. We don't even know you exist. You show up at our office with demonstration, bunch of papers, bunch of plots, bunch of curves, video, whatever, to show that you meet the standards. And all we're going to do is we're going to come to your facility and we're going to inspect the first vehicle you make and verify that it matches your design and that it's airworthy. But we're not going to say whether we think the design is good or bad, just whether it's going to stay in the air and not hurt anybody. And if they say yes, you get a sticker for that vehicle. And then if you want to build another one, you have to have them back again, another sticker, etc. But this category was very effective. I think within a few years of its being created, there were something like 50 new airplane designs on the market. So it really catalyzed everything. And again, our founders thought that that's the way to get to market in a much less capital intensive way than prior attempts, which didn't have this light sport aircraft category available. But on the other side of the ledger, staying under that weight limit, and at the time, again, they thought it was 1320, was impossible. So we had to go back to the FAA a couple times actually, and win concessions to go up to 1,800. 1,800 is still really hard. Don't get me wrong; it's still really hard.
I agree.
But yes, they're all three of them just fantastic designs, great looking aircraft.
Thank you.
Now, Kevin, you just mentioned something about the licenses.
Yeah.
And we talked briefly before this about, how do you get the license, what licenses are required, and what are the regulations with respect to those sorts of things? Sure.
For our vehicle, a standard driver's license is required. And then for flying, a special license called a sport pilot's license. It's not a full pilot's license. You go through the same ground school, so the same classroom time, but then instead of, for a regular pilot's license, needing to accumulate 40 hours of flying with a licensed pilot instructor, you accumulate 20 hours of flying. So it still takes time. You still can't knock it out in a weekend, but it lowers the barrier to entry. We think that's a selling point. Yeah.
And is that the same for, and does that go state by state? So is it the same in California or Oregon as it is in New Hampshire?
No, thank goodness that's a national situation. So,
okay.
Now, and Sam and Keith and I have been working for about 9 months on legislation on the inspection and registration side of things. That's state by state. But in terms of licensing for the operator, that's national. Even though it's a state license, the procedure is the same in all the states.
Okay, so what are the inspection requirements?
I don't know if you want to let them answer. They may have different licensing requirements than the transition does.
Good point.
Yeah, the Switchblade is an experimental aircraft, so it needs a private pilot license, which does require the 40 hours of in-air flight training as well as the ground school. And so you would need a private pilot's license. There's about, I don't know if you really, FAA's figures show about 600,000 or so private pilots either trained training pilots, pilots in training or registered pilots. I think it's probably closer to 200,000 or 300,000 that are actually, doing anything.
Mhm.
But there's still quite a few people, and I think that we're seeing a lot who would like to learn how to fly just to be able to get a flying car. So that's why we opted for two, option of having dual control, so you could learn to fly in a Switchblade if you wanted to, come build it, and then take it home and use it for your flight training. I don't know if that'll happen, but it's possible.
And for the PAL-V, the driving, you need a valid driver's license. So that back on that driver's ed question, you get your driver's license just like you would any other vehicle. And then on the flying part of it, you need to be at least a sport pilot, which is the 25-hour one. And because it's something called a rotorcraft, which covers gyroplanes and helicopters, things with rotors, you need an additional 10 hours because there are some differences in the way you fly a rotorcraft versus a fixed wing. So 25 hours for the sport license, and then an additional 10 to get your rotorcraft endorsement. And that's flight hours.
Now, are there significant differences between international requirements and the U.S. requirements? Like you're a Holland-based company, so what would somebody have to do there?
Yeah, well, so we have the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. That's our bureaucracy. And then over there, they have something called ESA, European Aeronautical Safety Administration, I think it's that. And so they have similar rules, but they're not exactly the same. An aircraft, if it's not experimental, it needs to be certified by the FAA. There's a process for getting certification. So PAL-V is getting their certification with the EASA. And what's interesting, recently, the FAA and EASA created a joint agreement where if you're certified in one jurisdiction, you're automatically certified in the other jurisdiction. So that was a happy, little accident that's happened recently.
Okay, another question. Are regulations heading where one can drive from the garage versus heading to an airport? This way it will be more of a commute vehicle than a personal travel vehicle.
Oh, so the question is, are regulations heading such that you could take off on the road instead of at an airport?
I think it's more, can you just plain drive this on the road as opposed to
I see.
flying?
Okay, sure. I mean, again, I'll answer for Terrafugia. That is the reason that the company came into being, is to create something that could be stored in your garage. You could walk out, put your bags in, turn it on, warm it up, and then drive to the closest airport. And by the way, 98% of the U.S. population lives within a 30-minute drive of one of these over 5,000 small regional airports. So they're all over the place. You just don't necessarily know they're there. So the idea is you drive to that, you're warmed up. Like I said in the introduction, you take off, you land, you reverse the process, and you're going to an airport that's, again, within 30 or fewer minutes of your destination. So that's absolutely the vision, and it's a reality. And to delve into the regulations just for a second, and again, Keith is the one who got this going, so I really credit him for contacting me and Sam about this. And but we've worked together and working on a unified way of, if you buy a roadable aircraft like one of our three, how do you get it inspected and registered so that it's legal to drive on the roads and fly in the air like I've just described. And so we worked together, crafted some legislation, and that's making its way through the legislature in the state of New Hampshire. So that's pretty exciting stuff. We're really excited about being able to have these customers be able to buy it and legally be able to operate it.
Yeah, that's great. Next, we have a question. The videos show both a plane style and a helicopter style. What are the pros and cons of each?
Yeah, so it looks like a helicopter, but it's called the gyroplane. Just to reiterate that, I'll give some pros and cons. I'm kind of reiterating what I said earlier, the gyrocopter form factor is a little more compact than the fixed wing. So the rotors are your lifting surface, and it creates like a frisbee, like a big umbrella. Even though it's just two rotors, when that gets spinning, it creates a disc of lift, if you understand that, and you're kind of suspended underneath it. And there's, there are advantages because it's a smaller form factor for your lifting surfaces. But then there's also the safety aspect of because it acts sort of like a parachute. If your engine cuts out, you can land, you can flare without power. So there's a safety aspect to it. It is, however, less efficient as far as like how much fuel you'll spend, or how far you can go. The gyrocopter is less efficient than a fixed wing. The fixed wing will get you further and use a little less fuel.
Yeah, I think you ought to talk about your cornering ability though with that tilt maker. Certainly cool.
That's true.
That years ago, and if you like a motorcycle, you like to lean in the corners, right? I mean, it's what you like to do. So for a motorcycle feel, I think the PAL-V's got it. They've got that kind of cornering, tilting type of thing. As a three-wheeler, you can pull it off. Car, not really, but in our case, we opted to go with the straight, flat suspension system, and did not opt for that extra to tilt in the corners. And we've been able to do exactly what our design said, which is as you go through a corner, keeping the center of gravity low and to the rear where the two wheels are, you can keep your overturning moment. It's called a moment. It's like a distance with a weight on the end is a moment. So if you keep it low and to the rear, that stays pretty tight to the ground, and you can go ahead and corner pretty well, keeping your tires flat to the ground. So that actually works out okay with kind of car tires. They've got a lot of grip if you can keep them flat.
And as far as the fixed wing, the Samson has an interesting feature where the body of the vehicle is also a lifting surface. Isn't that right?
Right. So for flying, and that was both a pro and a con.
Right.
We've done it in flight testing or in wind tunnel testing, which gets you within about 3% of reality, because it is actual wind over the surface type of a test. And at first I was super excited when the engineer came back and said, "Sam, I got wonderful news for you. Your car has a lifting body like the space shuttle. Your body lifts, and it actually doesn't stall." So we pitched up 30 degrees off the horizon. The wings stopped providing lift around 18 or something like that. And the body kept producing lift, more lift as it went. And I went, "Oh, this is great. I have a flying vehicle that won't stall." And then he splashed cold water on him. He said, "No, actually, the wings are stalled and you're coming down. It's just a mush. It's very nice, easy, gentle stall, but you're coming down. The body cannot lift you up." And that meant we had to get a bigger tail. And that is because when you do get into a stall, that means that you're too steep of an angle for the speed you're at, and you need to get flatter. And to get flatter, you have to drop the nose over and dive a little bit to pick up speed, and then you can fly. So we had to get a bigger tail because the center of the lift of the body was in front of where the wings are. So the combined lift was forward, but as soon as the wings stopped producing lift, you had the center lift go forward, and you had to have a lot more tail to push the nose over. So that meant a redesign on our tail, which is why we went to we call it a VT tail. A T tail is bam like that. We have two verticals, so it's a V and a T. It's interesting.
Nice. Oh, so ever since the 60s, people have wanted the watch that Dick Tracy talks into, and they wanted the car that the Jetsons fly. And so the next question, how long will it be until we start to see flying cars regularly used by the average person?
This will roll out slowly. I think Kevin mentioned this is 100 years in making this idea. They're going to be somewhat expensive in the beginning, but as production ramps up, the costs of scale of production can drive the costs lower and more approachable for the average person. Because it takes a little bit of training, you have to be invested in the time and effort required to get your pilot's license. So that'll put a limitation on the average person getting it. These technologies, I kind of view them as like a missing link, like a bridge between the old-fashioned cars that only stay on the road, and at some point a more futuristic Jetsons type future that we can kind of see taking shape. If you think about there's laws of physics. Kevin was mentioning about how something that makes a good airplane, if you put additional components on it to make it a roadable vehicle, it can kind of it's tricky to thread that needle with the laws of physics. There's another component to it, which is the laws of man. So people create laws and regulations, and the other trick is to design your vehicle to the regulations. And so we'll need regulations to change to get closer to that Jetsons future.
Kevin, I don't know about you, but I threw out my crystal ball. Man, Keith, I just don't have it anymore. It's parked out back there in the trash can somewhere, I'm sure, because we really would have liked to have flown, 2 years ago, and we're predicting that we would. And it takes as long as it takes to get the darn thing through to where you're happy, and that it can be a good, viable vehicle for people to fly. We're on those last little bits until we're in flight testing now. I'm expecting that if this last little bit with the engine goes well, we could be flight testing soon, and then we'll be on a ramp up for delivery in the next 2 years. So I think we're going to go into 3 prototypes. I think the next phase after an engineering review, 3 prototypes, and then go into a limited run of production for the first 25 the next year, and then head into bigger production after that. We have a kind of a big backlog, so we had to actually come up with ways to make carbon fiber parts more cheaply and more quickly, because we look at it and go, oh, how are we going to keep up with this?
Yeah.
We spent 3 years doing just nothing but that, and narrowing down on a system we think will do well for us. So I don't know, a few years is my best guess right now. If I had to pull that crystal ball out of the trash can and look one more time, but it's still the football that's failed me over for the last 2 years.
Just to tack on to what Keith and Sam were saying, irrespective of when these are available, there's also the issue of would it make sense for the average person to be using them? So at least for the transition, there is this locus of trips for which it makes sense to take the flying car. If you're going to fly 700 miles, or if you need to get 700 miles away, this vehicle isn't there, doesn't quite have that range to do it. So it might make more sense to fly commercially for that, because the time spent in this driving to the airport, parking in the security line, getting on the plane, etc. For a commercial aircraft that flies at 500 or 600 miles an hour, you can make up some of that time for these longer trips. And similarly, for a short trip, it makes sense to drive your car. So there's this intermediate set of trips where it makes a lot of sense to use a vehicle like the Transition or the PAL-V or the Samson Sky. So in terms of the average person, how many average people are going to want to make those trips? How often? And the other thing is, to get something in the air takes a lot of energy. It takes, and they're not necessarily complex, but a combined flying driving vehicle does have complexity to it. It has to be lightweight, and all those things add up to a purchase cost of making it, frankly, that is not going to be at the level of an average sedan anytime soon. There's just too many factors that go into it. And so I think that at some point, so when will the average person be using these things? If we can get to the point where a lot of people want to make those trips, we can sell more. The more we sell, we can bring the cost of construction down. So it'll be more in the reach of the average person. But there are so many variables there, it's hard to say when that's going to happen.
Well, very much related to that answer. Next question is, I really think it's time for the personal aircraft. We have personal computers, we have personal phones. This will probably help meet the weight requirements and the mechanisms for safety. What are your thoughts?
So I'll go first. This is Kevin again. So a couple thoughts on that are that you could make the argument that these two-seater aircraft are personal aircraft. If to make it one seat, actually, yes, saves some weight, and that makes the engineering challenges a little bit easier. But we found that a lot of people do prefer a two-seat craft versus a one-seat craft. Mm. And there are also, basically, okay, so there's the personal ownership model. And not to drift into the vertical takeoff and landing world for too long, but Terrafuji has also always had a vision of a vertical takeoff and landing craft that would be a personal vehicle that you stick in your garage, just like you do with the Transition. There's a lot of urban air mobility activity going on with electric vertical takeoff and landing air taxis and things like that that could whisk people around cities. And a lot of those are going to be shared use model, or where you buy a ticket and get a ride on that. You don't own the vehicle. But again, we think there's a place in society and people are going to want a personal vehicle like you're describing, both what we're making now and then down the road when the batteries get better and things like that get better. That's also vertical takeoff and landing. So I think the American dream is still alive in terms of driving. People are always going to want a personal car, or a personal vehicle, excuse me.
Right. Okay, well, this next one's amusing. Are flying cars safe? Do they have an autonomous mode to protect us from poor pilots?
Okay. I could tackle that one.
Sure.
Pilot training is pretty extensive. You don't get a pilot's license without a pretty thorough, not only just the theory, but actual practice and proving it and showing yourself and showing your instructor first, and then showing an FAA examiner second that you are proficient. And you don't just get a pilot's license by turning 18 or 16 or whatever you can get on the ground. You actually have to work for it a little bit and show that you can do this. And a private pilot license, or any pilot license for that matter, is not really, I'm a great pilot now. It just means that you're not dangerous. You're capable of flying and capable of flying safely. And you learn a lot from flying. You keep going, you keep flying in different conditions. Say you learned in the Midwest and then you go to Denver or something where they got these huge mountains. You find out the weather patterns are different there. The winds behave differently. And you have to sort of know that. And most guys, when they move or they fly in a different area, they learn about it. They're interested because it's their safety. If they don't, they're in trouble. So yes, on the ground, you might have some people who had a bad day and maybe they didn't want to stop at that stop sign. They're just going to go straight through. In the air, it's usually not that way. Usually you find that people are very conscious that their decisions up in the air matter. And so it's a little bit different. And I think personally, if you go undergo pilot training, you become a better driver as well. That's what I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How much power do these vehicles require compared to traditional cars?
Depends on the vehicle.
Yeah.
I guess you could look at gas mileage, right? Is that the question? I'm trying to get my head around the question. So you're going to
sure.
You're going to use a lot more, not a lot more, but significant amount more fuel flying because you're using energy to keep a fairly heavy object in the air, as opposed to just rolling down a road that's fairly smooth and you just have a little bit of rolling friction on the tires. An airplane is pushing itself through air molecules, and so you have to have power to push it through and also provide lift.
Okay. Speaking of that, now you're talking the road versus the air. What about things like speed limits? Who gives you a ticket if you're going too fast? The FAA or the state police?
That's a good question. So the legislation that that Kevin mentioned earlier is kind of modeled on it's in the state laws of New Hampshire. It's called a seaplane, but some people call it a float plane. And so, we're all familiar with what a float plane looks like, right? When it lands on a body of water, in the law, that becomes a boat. So it has to obey the rules of the public waterways, they're called.
Ah.
And so with this legislation for roadable aircraft, it can't land, it has to land in an airport. It can't land just anywhere. But once it goes onto the road, it has to obey the rules of the public roadways. And so it would be your local police or state police that would give you a ticket if you went over this. You didn't obey all the existing rules. And in the air, it's there's different ratings of aircraft. I think like 250 miles per hour or nautical miles per hour. I forget which one it is. There's a limit for if you go over 250 as far as like class of aircraft. And none of these vehicles will go that fast. So they're well within, the limit of, there's really no speed limit in the sky. It's really as fast as you can go. And cruise speed is something like 80% of your power. You're not gunning it all the time. You're cruising along, so you're not straining your engine.
So I'd actually like to, Rick, if you don't mind, I want to go back to an answer Keith gave before, which kind of ties into the answer you just gave in terms of it is one of the differences between a gyroplane and a fixed wing aircraft. And the fixed wing aircraft, as you're cruising along in the air, does get a substantial amount of lift from the air passing over the wings. And so unlike in the PAL-V, with the transition, the fuel burn per time isn't all that different when it's driving versus when it's flying. For us, it's as low as 4 gallons an hour when you're flying or driving. And to then answer the other question about power, so that Rotax engine that we have one of and Keith's PAL-V has two of is basically about 100 horsepower. Now, compared to an average sedan, especially these days, cars are getting bigger and heavier for good reason, because the federal motor vehicle safety standards keep increasing. They're keeping us safer and safer every year, reducing fatalities, et cetera. But as the cars get bigger, the engines get bigger. People still like their performance. And so I would say it'd be hard to find many engines out there that are not hybrid, pure gasoline engines that are going to be as low as 100 horsepower. So it's sort of, on these days, it's actually somewhat on the lower end of power. At least the transition is. Now the PAL-V flies faster, the Samsung flies faster. They're a little bit of a higher range. So in general, you're right in the middle of an average car.
Okay, great. So it looks like we've generated some interest here. Your next question is, are your companies publicly held and can we invest in them?
We're not publicly held. We're privately held, and I won't speak to other guys, but I don't know of any company in our situation that isn't looking for money, because it's just it's either you're growing or you want to grow, or you're going for that next vehicle model or something. And, it's just a matter of, do you want to take on the investment at this time, and what's the company value worth, and that kind of thing. Private stock is not as easy to buy, and it's not as easy to sell. So people looking for a small investment with something like a publicly traded stock that you can go in and out of easily, I'm not that kind of thing. So I'd be more interested in people with a longer view and wanting to take their monies out when we go for the next big expansion and outgrowth, which would allow people to exit with a bit of a increase in the stock value.
PAL-V is privately held. You can invest in it, but it's privately held, as Sam mentioned. Maybe one day PAL-V will go public, but right now it's privately held.
And listeners can approach you guys and offer to invest. Is that true?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. And so the difference with Terrafugia is that we were acquired by a fairly large company about 2.5 years ago, and at the moment we're not accepting other investment approaches. So that's, at the moment, we can't do that. I mean, an IPO down the road would be nice if things grow, and that's certainly a possibility. But at the moment, we are purely private.
Okay. Next question. Will these be required to take off and land at airports, or could someone stop at a gas station along their route?
You're right. Okay, so in terms, again, I'll answer for the transition. You can fill it up at any gas station you can see along the route, because almost all gas stations take 91 octane, but you do have to take off from an airport. There will be a future where you can take off not from an airport. I don't think there'll be a future where you can take off from the middle of I-93, going through Boston. But hopefully there will be a vertical takeoff and landing option, from the cul-de-sac at the end of the street or from a field nearby. But at the moment, you have to take off from an airport. Now, that being said, that's one of the beauties of this kind of a vehicle is that, like I said, there are 5,200 of these airports all over the country. Everyone's within a 20 to 30 minute drive. They're almost totally unused. I mean, it's outside of the big airports. Most of these don't have towers. You just kind of get on the radio and say, I'm coming in. And so they're an incredibly underused resource. So you just got to get to one and you're off. So I think in the short term, there's no regulation needed, no infrastructure changes needed to launch these. And that's what's great. Whereas if you look at the vertical takeoff and landing market, there's some big promise there, but there are also infrastructure and regulation challenges. So we think we have as long as we can get it finished and get it sold legally, we have a much more of a near-term product to offer.
Okay.
There's also the opportunity, if you have property, say you're a rancher or something with a lot of property, you could easily take off from your back 40 or driveway, whatever, as long as it's safe. And the main thing to watch out for there is fences and telephone poles near the takeoff landing spot. I had a friend who made his own runway just to be able to fly a Switchblade out. He just built it on property that he had. He knew he could get out. He knew he wasn't going to fly over his neighbors on the way out and in, so that he wasn't going to upset people, noise or anything like that. So, I mean, it can be done other than a public airport, but there you go.
Nice.
Okay. You mentioned the legislation that's actually in the New Hampshire right now, and they passed a hurdle last night. Is it premature to talk about that, what the benefits of that are, or can you sort of expound on what that means for your industry?
Yeah, I'd say of the three of us, only one of us is a former state legislator in New Hampshire, so I'll let Keith address that one.
Yeah. It's like 1 in 10 people have been former legislators in New Hampshire.
Okay, all right.
If you live here, I forget what they say. If you live here 10 years, you have to become one. Yeah, so I served 2 terms at the State House on the House side, and I was interested in squaring that circle with the legislation. The main reason behind the legislation, or one of the main reasons, is these are aircraft that have to be inspected by an FAA certified aircraft mechanic every year on an annual inspection. And there's other inspections, but and so you can't just take it to your local auto mechanic and have them inspect it, because they're not certified to work on aircraft. These vehicles are aircrafts first, in my opinion. They're secondarily a road vehicle. So that was one of the issues. But we worked with the Department of Transportation. The prime sponsor was Representative Stephen Smith. He had been the chair of the House Transportation Committee last term, but he's the ranking member in the minority now. And he's a transportation geek. He thinks about this stuff all the time. So when I approached him with the idea, he was on board. And we had back in January, we invited legislators and state senators to come and watch a presentation, just to kind of prime people on this idea, so it wasn't a shock and a surprise. And we had a good turnout. We had people from the State Department of Transportation, State Department of Aeronautics, the state police came. Someone from the state police. And state senators and legislators, and people were really excited after they saw the presentations. Afterwards, after it was over, people were staying around and excited about it, and that kind of primed the way for it to go through the House Transportation Committee, because several of the members of that committee came to that event, and so it passed the House Transportation Committee back in March, I believe, and it came out 20-0, so 20 in favor. And so there was no controversy. We had good support from the departments, the state department heads that came and testified. And the idea is do it in New Hampshire first and put New Hampshire on the map as far as being forward-thinking technologically. And then COVID happened, so we didn't know what was going to happen to it. But they've kind of worked around having remote hearings and social distancing, and it went through the Senate. Actually, this is geeky legislator stuff, but the main bill got tabled. But the Senate took the language from that bill and put it into what's called an omnibus amendment. So they were trying to figure out how to get legislation through the Senate because of the COVID shutdown, kind of put them behind schedule. So it went through on a different bill. And the amendment was, that other bill plus the amendment that contained the original language passed the House on a voice vote this week.
Senate.
So there's a Senate, I'm sorry. So there's 2 steps left in the process. It's goes back to the House so they concur with the changes, and then off to the governor to do what he wants with it, hopefully signs it. So I'm thinking probably middle of July, we would have a finalization of that.
And what does that enable you to do?
It enables you, if you want to read the language, it's the original bill, a standalone bill was House Bill 1517. So you can read it for yourself if you go on the state's website. But it basically covers inspection requirements. So instead of going to your mechanic to get inspected, you would go to your aircraft mechanic and you would get proof that he inspected it, he or she inspected it. And then you would take that to the Department of Transportation as proof of it being roadworthy. And then you can get a registration. In the bill, you don't need a license plate because the vehicle has a big, it's called the tail number. If you're familiar with airplanes or aircraft, so it won't need a license plate. It'll go by the federal number for the vehicle. And it usually begins with N in North America. And then you'll pay a registration fee that's kind of based on the value of the vehicle and the fact that it's going to be using the roads a little bit, but not a lot. And later this year, if and when the bill is signed by the governor, the State Department will they'll craft the forms that you'll need to fill out and the workflow for the regulator or for the agency to register, and that'll all be done hopefully later this year.
Okay, that's fantastic. We're coming to the end of our time. Is there anything else any one of you wanted to add before we finish up?
How many people saw the SpaceX launch, right? Or see all the cool stuff that people like Elon Musk are doing? It inspires people to look to the future when we do, interesting things like this, or when we, at least in our own small way, promote, the advancement of human society. And it, especially in the age that we're living in right now, the year 2020 has been kind of terrible. For me, this is something more like the SpaceX launch, which, gets little kids excited about science. And big people too.
Okay, well, thank you. This was a fascinating session, very informative. I appreciate your input. At this point, we'd like to thank you very much for both your time and your expertise. I really appreciated it. We need a good audience and we need a great panel to make these things work. And we had a great panel tonight. So thank you very much. And Dan Marchak will take it from here.
Thank you.
Thanks once again to our panelists, because if it wasn't for them and their willingness to appear for free, Science Cafe couldn't happen.
Also, please join us virtually on July 17th at 7 p.m. to learn more about music therapy.
And of course, Science Cafe takes a little funding to happen. So please help via the QR code next to me or through our website at www.sciencecafenh.org. Thanks for coming to Science Cafe, where the beers cost less, but the service varies.